Time for action. Over the past 3 episodes, we've been talking about the criminal justice system, what Christ says about forgiveness, theologies of punishment, and the concept of justice itself. But all of that talk is meaningless if we don't do anything. So how do we apply it? And in particular, how do we apply it in the case of George Floyd? Find out more in today's episode of... On Monday, an unarmed 46-year-old black man, George Floyd, was killed by a Minneapolis police officer in a horrendous video that was seen around the world. It sparked protests across the United States all week long, and as of this filming, the officer involved has just been arrested and charged with manslaughter. In our first session, we talked about the issues of mass incarceration, police profiling, and racism within our justice systems, both in the United States and in Canada. I encourage you to check out Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which demonstrates how the war on drugs targeted communities of color and perpetuates Jim Crow era discrimination and oppression. We talked about racial profiling by police and the injustices that result in a disproportionate number of people of color in the prison system. And now, in this past week, we have seen with our own eyes all these issues laid bare. In New York on Monday, a white woman was filmed calling the cops on a black man who asked her to leash her dog. She weaponized race in that phone call, knowing that the police would respond faster and more violently if she said she felt threatened by an African American man. And then, on the same day, in Minneapolis, police were called about a suspected $20 counterfeit bill, an encounter that ends with George Floyd's murder. If there was ever any doubt about the prevalence of racial profiling or discriminatory treatment that people of color face when they encounter law enforcement, let that be put to rest now. We have seen it many times before, but this week made it undeniably clear. In the video of George Floyd, there was this one part that could have easily been missed. As the bystanders are shouting at the cops to get off of Floyd, one cop says, "Don't do drugs, guys." It's a bizarre comment to make in the middle of everything's going on. Drugs had nothing to do with Floyd's arrest. It only makes sense when you consider what Michelle Alexander said about the war on drugs and mass incarceration. The war on drugs has been the excuse for state-sanctioned violence. All they had to say was this guy was on drugs or suspected of drugs. And in that video, the cop is claiming, as they are killing the man, that they can get away with it if they just say the magic word, drugs. And there's no doubt that that's exactly what they would have done if it wasn't all caught on camera. And Canadians, we can't be looking our noses down at our neighbours to the south. In our first video, we had heard evidence from a study conducted by Akwantu Kenti about the war on drugs in Canada, which has had all here a disproportionate impact on the black Canadian communities. And we know from the TRC report that this is an even bigger problem for Indigenous communities. The situations that were discussed in week 1 of our course are tragically illustrated in the death of Floyd. But what do we do? What does justice for Floyd look like? Well, let's recap the second video. In week 2, we explored what the Bible says about punishment, and in particular what Jesus had to say about punishment. And Jesus has a lot to say about forgiveness. It's tricky, and I want to address this with 3 points. First of all, when I discuss Christ's command to forgive, you need to know that I am saying this as a faith statement. I need to forgive because as a follower of Jesus, this is what he told me to do. If you're not a follower of Jesus, then ignore the bit about forgiveness. Last week, we heard Danielle Starrett explain that forgiveness is totally unnecessary when advocating for restorative justice and prison abolition. Any talk of forgiveness is something we wrestle with in our own hearts. It's between me and God, and sometimes the other person. So, thinking of George Floyd, do I need to forgive the police officer? Well, that's an inappropriate question because the crime wasn't against me. As a white person, I'm upset by these events, but I am not the victimized by them. I'm not the one that's hurt. In fact, speaking in broad societal historical terms, I am not the victim, I am the violator. And it is very inappropriate for the violator to expect or demand forgiveness. Abusers often abuse the notion of forgiveness. They'll put pressure on the victim of abuse to forgive them, making them feel guilty if they don't. That's wrong. It's not what forgiveness is about. Whether someone chooses to forgive is about their own healing, done on their own terms, and it doesn't mean that we pretend nothing happened. Forgiveness does not equal reconciliation. And third, forgiveness would not mean an end to these protests or riots. The protests are a statement of a broken relationship. It is the abused standing up to their abuser and saying no more. So whether or not Floyd's family or members of the black community choose to forgive is their own business, not an appropriate thing for me to expect or demand, and does not mean that things move back to where they were or that others need to play nice. So how do we move forward? What does justice look like? In week 3, we talked about our theologies of punishment. About the fact that our culture and our penal system is centered around punishment, around retribution, an eye for an eye. But as Christians, Christ abolished punishment, took that punishment on the cross to stop the cycle of vengeance and violence. And Christ calls us to a greater justice. What does it look like? Well, think of the justice for Floyd. If justice was retribution, then arresting the cops involved and sentencing them to life in prison would satisfy it. But that alone isn't satisfying, is it? The problem with an eye for an eye is that it's never enough. It might be a little cathartic, but it's not cathartic enough. It doesn't make up for the pain and the trauma. We're looking for more. What satisfies our yearning for justice? Well, real confession, repentance, and reconciliation. We want those who caused harm to acknowledge their actions and to work towards fixing the problem that they caused. Justice for Floyd means not just that those specific police officers are held accountable, but that all of society is held accountable for our systemic racism and the sufferings that we caused that led to this crisis. There is a damaged relationship that we have with the communities of color in our countries, and that calls for healing and reconciliation. If you're Canadian Presbyterian, you've probably heard a lot about healing and reconciliation. It's something that's brought up at every General Assembly. For those unfamiliar, when the Presbyterian Church in Canada acknowledged and confessed our role in residential schools, we started a journey of healing and reconciliation with Indigenous communities. And it's been a very long journey. Some have felt that once we apologized and confessed that it should have been enough. We said we're sorry, so they should forgive us and move on. But it doesn't work that way. What we confessed to was that we caused immense damage to Indigenous people, that we had broken our relationship with them. And we've just started the work of healing that relationship. It will take generations. And it requires some real changes in our attitudes and in our theologies. It means that we're going to be called out when we fail in that relationship, and we need to remain humble enough to listen and change. The same for Floyd. If justice for him simply means incarcerating the cops, it won't address the factors that led to his death. For there to be justice, a bigger conversation needs to be had about racism, about deeper changes that need to happen to bring healing to those who have been racialized. What I've been describing in all of this today is essentially the work of restorative justice. Canada's Department of Justice describes restorative justice as an approach that gives the parties directly affected the opportunity to identify and address their needs in the aftermath of a crime. It places the focus on people and relationships involved, not just the violation of the law. It gives more voice to the victims while also being more effective in providing restitution to them and reducing recidivism in offenders. Now, there's a lot of sources I could have used to back up that fact, but just to bring it home, that little bit came from the Justice and Solicitor General of the Government of Alberta. They endorse restorative justice. There's a lot of ways to do it, but basically it's about the parties involved sitting down together to find a way to bring healing. I'm pleased to report that while it doesn't get a lot of attention, restorative justice is something that churches have been actively involved in. In Canada, we've got the Anglicans, Catholics, Lutherans, Mennonites, Presbyterians, and the United Church as members of the Church Council on Justice and Correction, and that's a group dedicated to promoting restorative justice. More than that, in the year 2000, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops spoke out in favor of restorative justice, but also called to address the issues that lead to crime, that's poverty, addictions, cycles of violence, and they demanded an end to rigid mandatory sentencing and 3 strikes you're out rules. In 2003, the Presbyterian Church USA wrote a resolution calling for the abolishment of for-profit private prisons. In 2011, my own denomination wrote to the Attorney General of Canada to raise our concerns that Canada was spending more money on building prisons rather than mental health and addiction treatments, and that there is a disproportionate number of inmates from poor and marginalized communities. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America in 2013 called for an end to private prisons as well as a close scrutiny on the war on drugs. And the Reformed Church in America in 2014 called mass incarceration the most critical social issue of our day. That same year, the Alliance of the Baptists called their members to lead in the struggle to dismantle mass incarceration and the criminalization of race. Most of these statements had followed shortly after the new Jim Crow was published, and they quote Alexander's book directly. But from what I can find, that there's not been a lot of talk about these issues in the church over the past couple of years. With the events of George Floyd's death, now is the perfect time to be bringing back to the forefront of our conversations. But this time, we can't be as timid as we were in the past. Our churches did make bold statements for prison reform, but reform is still not bold enough. What we need is an abolishment of prisons. It's a much bigger vision with greater pressure. It can only be accomplished if we also address all of the other factors that lead to incarceration. Poverty, mental health, intergenerational trauma, education, employment opportunities, racism, substance abuse, all of those need to be heavily invested in and supported. Those will reduce the number of people who fall through the cracks and into the justice system to begin with.
The underlying issue is we've chosen prison as a way to respond to that problem of crime. And there are a whole variety of ways that we could have chosen to respond to that problem of crime. We've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty, and we've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty for a historically aggrieved group whose liberty in the United States was never firmly established to begin with.
Setting our sights on prison abolition helps us to stay focused, requiring us to change our mindsets about punishment and to get serious about restorative justice, making us consider more urgently what we want the outcomes to be for a person who has a brush with the law. The abolition of prison does not mean that criminals are not held accountable. In fact, by using a restorative justice model, they are held even more accountable, and the victim experiences more healing, having had a direct hand in determining what justice looks like for them. And most crucially for Christians, as I hope to show in the previous 2 videos, abolishing prisons is more in keeping with the radical work that Jesus Christ was doing, and a truer reflection of what our theology teaches. Now, I'm not opposed to reforming the system. Reform is good too, but our vision needs to be bigger. And I pray for a world where there are no prisons, and I believe we can get there. And here's the good news. While the work ahead could take a lifetime, it starts by casting a vision now in your community. Sharing these thoughts or maybe these videos with others, getting your church and your denomination to talk about it. Presbyterians, we have it really easy because any church, any session can overture a General Assembly and prompt a national discussion. And now, of all times, it is vitally important that we talk about state-sanctioned violence, the criminalization of race, the injustice of retributive punishment, and the atrocity of mass incarceration. Addressing these issues would be one step towards bringing justice for George Floyd, for Breonna Taylor, for Ahmaud Arbery, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Philando Castile. The list goes on. Thank you for watching this video, and if you watched all 4 videos, thank you very much for your willingness to explore these ideas. I don't pretend to know everything about the topic. I definitely haven't covered all of the facets involved. So as we conclude, please let me know your thoughts. How do you feel about what we heard? What do you wish was said? What steps do you think we need to take next? I know for me that this is just a beginning, and I'm going to be reflecting on what was presented here for a long time to come. I pray that might be the same for you.